Hi, my name's Nimish Lad. I'm a Vice Principal at Wren School in Northamptonshire. I've been a physics teacher for 13-14 years, teaching mainly from Key Stage 3 down or up to Key Stage 5. I've done a bit of work in Key Stage 1 and 2 as well. So I'm here to talk for Chat Physics today about building for independent practice. So independent practice is something that I initially thought I was really good at as a teacher. I thought I got my students working independently and working for themselves and working by themselves essentially, and taught them those skills really well. But it was only when I started to look into the reasons why some of my students were underperforming that I realised that there was something that I wasn't preparing students for at all, and that I needed to build a more structured process of helping my students become independent learners and have that ability to practice a subject independently. So in this video, I'll talk about what independent practice is, why it's important, sorts of tasks that work well for independent practice, and how we prepare students for independent practice. So what is that process that I now go through, that we need to consider to make students independent learners? So when we talk about this idea of independent practice, what I think about is where students have reached a position where they can apply their own learning and check their understanding of that learning with minimal input from ourselves as teachers. So where we can give them a set of questions and the answers, and they can go through the question themselves, use the answers to mark their questions, find areas of underperformance, and go away and go through that diagnostic process themselves of trying to fix it, diagnosing where the problem is, fixing it, and then having a go at it again. Why this is so important is that a pupil or pupils, that should say, are fluent in a specific topic area. We have limited time with them in the classroom. I know it varies between 9 to 10 hours a fortnight in terms of A-level subjects. That's a lot of time. However, students have more time than that. They have time where they're not in a taught lesson, and that's the time that we can tap into with independent practice to help students become fluent in areas that they know and we know that they are potentially underperforming in. Independent practice is really important because it allows students to reinforce prior learning, but also makes that links to newer learning from that as well. And that's what builds a wide schema at the end of the day. If independent practice is absolutely nailed, our students will have a wide schema because they can go away and find where gaps in their knowledge are, gaps in their schemas are, and fill them themselves. And the key to this entire process is it removes the burden from us as teachers. We don't need to necessarily be there facilitating every last action of a pupil to ensure that progress is being made, that they're progressing through the curriculum, that they're becoming better physicists or whatever subject it is that independent practice has been applied in. I am not here advocating a student-led approach here. This again is at the end of a process of work being taught. Work should be taught and assessed, and our students should go away and practice this. I myself am very approach teaching from a real teacher-led point. I'll be honest, I wasn't always like that. It's something that I've gradually gone towards in the last 7-8 years, that the teacher is the expert, the teacher's at the front, delivers the content, but that doesn't mean that students don't work independently. The independent part of the learning process is that practice, which is crucial. So what sort of tasks can work well for independent practice? What sort of tasks can we set for independent practice? So SLOP is perfect for this, so shared loads of practice. I know it's a term used by quite a few people on Twitter who I have to thank for opening my eyes to SLOP. I mean, I've used SLOP, I've never called it SLOP before in the past, but people like Adam Boxer and others on Twitter have really pushed it to the forefront of thinking in terms of pedagogy. And it's really brought it to the front of my mind that I have had these resources that I dip in and out of, which I'll show some towards the end of this presentation. But now I use them much more than I used to before. Exam questions, great for independent practice. Students can practice what they're going to get in their final end of key stage assessment in terms of an A-level paper, a GCSE paper. But if you want to make it independent and truly independent, you've got to give them the mark scheme. Therefore, they can mark it themselves, diagnose gaps themselves, and then go away and work on it. Recall or knowledge-based questions. So really simple questions, anything based around bits of knowledge that need to be learned, or simple recall questions, linking to SLOP again, they're great for independent practice. Anything where self-quizzing can take place. And again, remember, if it's a self-quiz, you've got to provide the mark scheme, some way in which student can quiz themselves. And anything the pupils can self-mark. Like I've said from the start of this, it's got to be something that the students can do entirely by themselves. So how do I prepare students for independent practice? Well, I go through this process where I first teach them. I examine what I know from that. That's not necessarily with an exam, but it's like examining their bank of knowledge, their schema. Essentially, I look for the gaps that I then reteach and try to fill before I set them off on some form of independent practice. So I'm just going to move this over to here. There we go. Right, so I teach content in class in the usual way that I teach. I try to make the links to prior knowledge really clear, so they know that what I'm teaching them right now links explicitly to something they know from before. I ensure that everything that I've given them for independent practice has been covered. So I try to make sure that anything that they're going to be doing for independent practice I've covered during that teach time. And if it's something that they're going to have to recall from, say, a year or so ago, I'll make sure that I mention that specifically while I'm teaching that unit of knowledge, that chunk, that part of the scheme of work or scheme of learning. And then I sort of examine what they picked up from what I know. And it's usually through some form of extending writing activity. And I'll show you an example of how I structure one of those. I then provide feedback either through a model answer or that could put under the visualizer, or I could do live modeling under the visualizer so they can see what I would have written as an expert in that situation. And then reteach anywhere where there's gaps in knowledge or where they haven't made the link explicitly to prior knowledge or other areas of knowledge, where the schema isn't strong. I've done some reteach there. It's only then that I set them off on some independent practice tasks. And again, I'll make sure that where it's appropriate, which 9 times out of 10 is always, I'll give them self-marking, unless there's obviously something that I'm going to take in and mark and give them specific feedback on. But yeah, that's where the independent practice comes into it, at the end of that entire process, like I was saying before. So here's almost how I'd structure up to that point. So what I do is I teach them in the situations about Newton's laws. I teach them about Newton's laws, all 3 of Newton's laws. I'd give them examples in class. I'd use modelling to give them an understanding of some of the more abstract situations in terms of Newton's laws. I'd give them plenty of examples and non-examples when it comes to Newton's laws, and make sure that they've got a really solid beta schema in their mind before I go any further with it. To test that they've got it in there, to examine their schema, I'd set them a question like this question number 1 at the top over here. So, how do Newton's laws relate to the motion of objects? A really broad, big question there. And it's broken down into smaller areas so the students know what they've got to write about here. And I can see a little spelling mistake in there, and I'll go through that in a second. The idea is that through this big question, I can examine what they know, what's in their schema about Newton's laws and forces and how it relates to motion. And therefore, before they go off on any independent learning task, I can check to see that they've got the bank of knowledge that's required for them to practice independently. So how do we calculate the resultant, I should say, force of coplanar and perpendicular forces? How does a resultant, again, force affect acceleration? How is Newton's second law related to momentum? And how is Newton's third law to a situation? So if they can do those 4 things, I'll feel fairly comfortable that they've got a good grasp of Newton's laws. So I'd give them to that as an open-ended task. They then write about that, and then that is what I'd live model under a visualizer, or I'd take a model answer of and show back to them to make sure that they have a very good bank of knowledge in their mind and in their books on Newton's third laws. Then I'd set them off on their independent task. Now, before they do their independent task, it's almost like I want to activate that knowledge that they have in their mind. I want to bring it to the forefront, but with a lot less scaffolding than I gave them before. So in that question one, that schema checking activity, as you might want to call it, I broke it down into 4 questions. That big question was broken down to 4 smaller questions. That there was real clear scaffolding for what they need to know about Newton's laws there. Before they run off and do their independent learning task independently, I want them to do this explaining everything over here, where they just explain everything they know about an area just to activate that prior knowledge to do Newton's laws. So over here, it'd be Newton's 3 laws, and you describe a bouncing ball. So a bunch of key phrases to include in there, a bunch of keywords to include in there. And they do that, it will bring their knowledge to the front of their mind about Newton's laws before they start going through any slop, going through any exam questions, going through anything like that. And then this would be the sort of exam question that they'll be doing. So straight from a past paper, put onto there, giving them a chance to actually answer it, giving them a mark scheme with it as well. That's what I get them to do independently. Now, that would be if it was an exam question. It wouldn't just be one, there'd be 4, 5, 6 like this, all based around Newton's laws, for them to constantly practice answering questions on Newton's laws. So that's that process of some form of schema checking activity, an explaining everything task that just reactivates their sort of like prior knowledge of what they've learned in the classroom, and they do that independently, and then answering a set of exam questions. And if you're after like banks of exam questions or banks of slop questions, banks of exam questions, you can get them from exam building software like Exam Wizard, Exam Pro, Exam Quest. But if you're after like banks of questions for slop, then I cannot go any further than suggesting these 2 books. Practice in Physics, which is absolutely brilliant. It's been around an age. It was there when I was a student at school doing A-level physics. I remember using it myself. It's great because it only gives the final answer in the back, so you have to find your way to it. So keep battling your way through it. And 99 Problems for A-level physics. Again, absolute brilliant book, broken down in topic areas, just like Practice in Physics is, and great for slop questions. So that's my process in terms of helping my students become independent, and how I guide them to the point of independent practice. Thank you very much for listening, guys.